while a majority of men believe that they do at least half of the chores around the house, if not more, turns out that same study finds that women believe that they are the ones who are doing most of the chores. So who's right? Who's doing most of the chores in the household? And look, to be fair, gender roles in America have been changing over the last several decades. Men, to their credit, have been contributing more to household duties that, previous generations did not contribute to. So we'll get to who's right and who's wrong in just a minute. But first, let's take a closer look at the study that was conducted by YouGov. Here's what they found. And we should take note that this chart does not include chores pertaining to child rearing or child care. And I would venture to say that that kind of work is very, very difficult work, but it's excluded from this study. So let's take a look at what the results were. 42% of men believe that they do all or most of the chores. 33% of men believe that they do about half of the chores. So combined, 75% of men believe that they are at least carrying their weight. Meanwhile, a whopping 63% of women believe that they do all or most of the chores. 22% of women believe that they do about half of the chores in the household. So that means that 85% of women believe that they do at least one half or more of the errands around the house. Now, who's actually doing more? Well, you probably won't be surprised with the answer because the Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that in 2023, adult women spent almost twice as much time as their male peers doing chores around the house. They cooked, cleaned, and did yard work for an average of 1.9 hours a day, nearly 2 hours a day, compared with 1 hour for men. So, Cenk, you are a man. What say you?
Well, look, I think men are doing more. Well, it's not a matter of I think. The numbers show it. But just because you're doing more doesn't mean that you're doing the same or enough. And so this story has a lot to do with relationships, but it also has a lot to do with expectations and even the media. So if your expectations as a man was to not do much housework and then you wind up doing some, you think like, oh my God, I'm over delivering. And it feels like you're probably doing half, right? But the numbers show that it's not. So I understand that phenomenon, and I understand women being very frustrated by it. So another part of it that's interesting is about the media, because men have picked up a little bit more in terms of laundry and cleaning and stuff, just a little bit. And women's percentages of doing that has gone down a little bit, right? But in cooking, what I noticed that both of men and women went up. And men went up more. And then as I read the whole, study, Anna, what became clear to me is that the Food Network had an enormous impact. That people started watching these shows about cooking, and now it's on the streaming services, et cetera, as well. And they just thought cooking was fun. So they both started doing more. So actually, when you take that into account, men are doing even less than they realize. Because to them, cooking is kind of fun. And they say that in the survey.
Yeah, in fact, men tend to see cooking as a hobby. And look, it really depends on what your personal preferences are, of course, right? So I find cooking fun. We talk about love language on the show time to time, and I think it's like a fascinating discussion because I do think that there's some evidence to show that there's merit behind the whole love language argument. So for me, I express my love and I feel most loved when someone is engaging in acts of service or when I do acts of service for someone else. Like if I'm doing an act of service for you, that means that I love you. Okay. Like I care about you. I value you. And so cooking, feeding people is part of that for me. So it's not just like a fun hobby. It's about showing my admiration for people, showing that I respect people and want to serve them in some way. But what's interesting is like the different perceptions of cooking. So statistics show that men are spending, to your point, Cenk, much more time preparing meals than they used to, even as the time we spend on other chores flatlines or falls. Every single demographic cooks more than in the 2000s. So this is the Washington Post's analysis of the study. But the increase is not equal. The share of men who cook on a given day has risen twice as much as the share of women, and men have outgained comparable women within every demographic. So that's super interesting. And look, again, it all really depends on preferences. I would prefer to cook, mostly because I know how to cook and clean at the same time. So I can sit down and enjoy my dinner without worrying about going back to the kitchen and dealing with a massive mess. If my husband cooks, that's not going to be the case. I'm going to go into the kitchen and see a big mess, and I'm not looking forward to that. But I will say this. I don't know if this study accounted for certain errands or chores that aren't necessarily in the household, but are still annoying errands that we have to run. And these tend to be errands that men take care of. So for instance, when my car needs to get serviced, like right now, I need to get a smog test because my car is so old. And so in California, we have regulations to make sure that your car isn't emitting a bunch of smog and polluting the air. I don't want to deal with it. So like, I know my husband's going to deal with it. And that's a chore that I don't have to deal with, but it's not really included in the analysis of this study. So that's another thing to take into account. You know, there are things that men do that women, generally speaking, I know it's not always the case, don't do if they're in a, dual income household.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a controversial question back at you. Do you think it matters who works or who works more in the relationship in terms of who should do more at the house?
100%. Yes. So if one person is putting in 16-hour days and the other person either doesn't work or is working part-time or just a normal 8-hour job, I would expect the one working less to put in a little more work at home. So yeah, I definitely think that. What do you think?
Yeah. It's interesting because that's considered kind of an old school way of thinking about it. But I agree with you. Like the other person is providing for the family as well. They're doing it through working and bringing the finances to be able to do the things that we need to do. But I feel like a lot of people in the modern world would push back on that and say that that's kind of sexist or something. And no, you don't have to have these traditional roles. And again, I'm not basing on gender. I'm just saying on whoever works more.
Same. Yeah. For me, it's not gender based. It really depends because look, I see a relationship or a marriage as a partnership. And so that partnership is not going to work and resentment will build if one person is putting in way more work than the other. And so if you have an individual working long hours and they're coming home to their spouse or their significant other who either doesn't have an as demanding job or gets to stay at home, which is rare these days, but let's just say that's the case. I mean, you would expect that person who's staying at home to put in a little more work when it comes to the household errands. And in fact, like if I were a homemaker, I would love that. Like I would have no problem with cleaning and grocery shopping and all of the things that become unbearable and annoying when you work long hours, right? So that's the way I think about it. I don't think it's sexist at all.
Yeah, and but men have to keep in mind that also applies to them, right? So if your wife is a high-powered lawyer, doctor, whatever, she's putting in 60 hours, well, then you're not putting in as many hours. We're not judging you, brother, right? But then you got to pick up the slack. Right?
I'm judging a little bit for not picking up the slack, not because of the work situation. Like every relationship is different. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And so, look, it's still getting a little bit better. But what would be ideal is if we split the work evenly between the office and home. And that's what we're trying to get to. But so far, especially with women working more these days, a lot more, they're still carrying the bigger load. And keep it real on that.